As any fan who has more than a cursory knowledge of the UFC is well aware, the UFC loves to play favorites. While the average fighter has to build themselves up by facing tough competition outside the rankings, fighters like Sean O'Malley, Bo Nickel, and Shara Magomedov get favorable matchups and big opportunities. But then, there are fighters who sit on the opposite end of the Dana White privilege spectrum. Fighters who seem to be absolutely loathed by the UFC for one reason or another, and just never seem to get what they deserve based off of their body of work. In other words, the polar opposite of an industry plant. So in this video, let's go through the top 10 fighters who are currently on the UFC roster that I believe are the most hated by the UFC based off of how little their accomplishments are rewarded, how tough their matchmaking is, and how few opportunities they get. So without further waiting, let's get started. So, starting at number 10 on this list, we have the prospect killer himself, Charles Energy Johnson. Now, as everybody knows, Charles Johnson KO'd the current flyweight champion, Joshua Van, with a brutal uppercut back in 2024, and then also became the one to take Lonnie Kavanaugh's O in 2025 with another highlight reel KO. Now, I would have had Charles Johnson much higher up on this list if it hadn't been for the chance at a top 10 ranking he got against Asu Amabayev at UFC Baku, but well, he got that opportunity and fumbled it badly, so he's only at 10th place here. But seriously, if you look through Charles Johnson's career, you'll see that he's gotten a rough go of it for the vast majority of his UFC career. And to demonstrate what I mean by this, let's go back and look at Charles Johnson's run back in 2024, where he had the best year of his career. After going on a 3-fight skid against Ode Osborne, Cody Durden, and Rafael Estevam, the last of which missed weight by 2 pounds, Charles Johnson rebounded by going on a 4-fight win streak, including a win over the previously undefeated Azat Maxim, which was the fight of the night, a win over Jake Hadley, that KO win over Joshua Van, and a win over Sumer Durji. And now, after going on a 4-fight win streak in the flyweight division, Charles Johnson ended up getting ranked at number 14. And now, typically, if a fighter goes on a 4-fight win streak and then ends up getting ranked at number 14, you would think that the UFC would end up matching him up against, somebody who's ranked number 10 or number 8. But no, the UFC matched Charles Johnson up with Ramazan Temirov, an 18-2 Uzbekistani power puncher who had only had one win in the UFC up until that point, with that one win being over CJ Vergara, a guy who was 3-4 in the UFC at that point. And now, Charles Johnson went on to lose that fight against Temirov by unanimous decision. But guess what? Ramazan Temirov ended up testing positive for trimetazine, a metabolic modulator that increases cardiovascular performance, just 3 months out from his fight with Charles Johnson. So basically, there's a very high chance that Ramazan Temirov was on the sauce when he fought Charles Johnson. But since he tested positive 3 months out from the fight, this still remains a loss on Charles Johnson's record. So if you look at this fight from Charles Johnson's perspective, you went on a 4-fight win streak in the UFC, including a win over a future champion, and then you ended up getting matched up against an opponent who was probably on the sauce, who only had one win in the UFC prior to fighting you, who then tests positive. And then after that loss to Temirov, Charles Johnson ended up getting matched up against Lonnie Kavanaugh on Kavanaugh's home turf in Shanghai, China, where he did ended up getting another prospect kill win. And then from that point onwards, Charles Johnson alternates between losses and wins, where he loses against Alex Perez, who missed weight, wins a close split decision against Bruno Silva, and then gets completely dominated by Asu Amabayev. And now, you would think that losing to Asu Amabayev would probably lead to you, fighting somebody who's slightly outside of the rankings or something along those lines, right? But no, Charles Johnson doesn't get that treatment. Instead, he gets matched up with Jose Ochoa, a guy who is 2-2 in the UFC, and is likely firmly outside of the rankings. And here's the thing with Charles Johnson, right? I know that a lot of people think he's terrible, but I only think that's true for certain matchups. Charles Johnson is kind of a striker's nightmare, having knocked out Joshua Van and Lonnie Kavanaugh, right? Charles Johnson has a solid shot at beating basically every single striker in the flyweight division, but will likely lose to every single grappler. The threat that Charles Johnson presents on the feet is nothing to be scoffed at. But regardless of that, he is now fighting a guy who is 2-2 in the UFC, and this kind of shows how little he is thought of by the UFC matchmakers. But anyways, that is what leads me to place Charles Johnson at number 10 on this list. And now, moving on to number 9, let's talk about Elvis Brenner. So Elvis Brenner, he is 3-3 in the UFC, and he's currently on a 3-fight losing streak, and he hasn't fought in nearly a year. But the thing is, you will know why he is on a 3-fight losing streak if you just go and look at the competition he has been facing. His losses are to Muktabek Orolbai, Yoel Alvarez, and Esteban Ribovic. 2 of those losses are to guys who are now at welterweight. The matchmakers were completely and utterly ruthless to Elvis Brenner, especially when you consider that his UFC debut was against Zubaira Tukhugov, where he got a huge upset win, a KO win against Guram Kutateladze, where he got a great comeback KO, and a pretty nasty highlight reel KO against Kanyan Kruswetsky, which put him on a 3-fight win streak that sort of made him a prospect back in 2023. But after those pretty impressive wins, he was totally fed to the wolves. He got Muktabek Orolbai, a guy who later on went to dominate 2 former middleweights in Jack Hermanson and Chris Curtis, Joel Alvarez, who is 6'3" and just a massive lightweight overall who's now fighting at welterweight as well, and then Esteban Ribovic, who is a tough and scrappy brawler. And now Elvis Brenner, he's on a 3-fight losing streak, and I don't know when we're going to see him in the UFC again, which is a real shame since he's a very, very entertaining fighter. However, that time might be coming right around the corner since he recently won a grappling match against Zubair Tukhugov in ACBJJ. Personally, I would like to see Elvis Brenner fight down at featherweight since he's a very small lightweight and he spent the majority of his regional career down at featherweight as well. But yeah, just overall, I believe that Elvis Brenner, he was the victim of some pretty difficult matchmaking, and I would like to see him set back on the right path soon. And next, at number 8, we have another lightweight in Mateusz Rebecki. And well, Mateusz Rebecki, he is 4-4 in the UFC and is currently on a 3-fight losing streak. However, that's not because he's been fighting low-level competition. No, on the contrary, he's been fighting killers. His 3 recent losses are to Chris Duncan, Ludovic Klein, and Grant Dawson, who are all pretty damn good lightweights outside of the rankings. And then if you go back and look at Rebecki's most recent win, it was over Muktabek Orolbai, which is a win that has aged crazily well when you consider how well Orolbai has done up at 170 pounds. However, there's a reason why I have Mateusz Rebecki above Elvis Brenner in this conversation, and that's because 2 of the losses in his 3-fight losing streak were against Grant Dawson and Chris Duncan, who both train at the same gym that he does, American Top Team. It is quite common for American Top Team fighters to fight each other, but to fight 2 of your teammates within a 3-fight losing streak, that's gotta be tough. And it just goes to show that the matchmakers really don't care about Rebecki, and are frankly just fine matching him up against whoever. And as a consequence, he is now on a 3-fight losing streak despite being one of the most entertaining fighters in the lightweight division, having gotten 3 Fight of the Night bonuses in a row in his fights against Orolbai, Chris Duncan, and Ludovic Klein. However, the one saving grace for Rebecki, and the reason why he's not any higher up on this list, is that he's getting sort of a step down in competition against Kyle Prepolek on the UFC Serbia card. So there's that. But if you look at the overall trajectory of Rebecki's UFC career, you can see that the matchmakers really just see him as a guy that they can toss on a card to boost the levels of violence on a fight night. And it kind of is a shame because Mateusz Rebecki is probably my favorite unranked lightweight. And now, moving on to number 7, let's talk about yet another lightweight in Beneil Dariush. And well, with old Benny here, you can see what the UFC wants from him at this point in his career. Beneil Dariush is 1-4 in his last 5 fights, with all 4 of those losses coming by way of round 1 KO. It really is clear at this point that the UFC sees him as a guy that can be thrown in there to get KO'd by a young and hungry prospect like Benoit Saint-Denis or Quillen Salkild. However, that's not the only reason why I have Beneil Dariush all the way up this high on this list. Prior to his loss to Charles Oliveira in 2023, Beneil Dariush was on an 8-fight winning streak. Typically, if you go on an 8-fight win streak, you're going to get a title shot. And people forget, man, back in 2022, prior to that loss to Charles Oliveira, everybody was saying that Beneil Dariush was going to be the guy who was gonna give Islam Makhachev his hardest test. And back then, that might have actually been the case. Beneil Dariush has very, very good BJJ and anti-wrestling, glimpses of which he has shown as recently as the Renato Moicano fight and even the Quillen Salkild fight. And while it is completely unthinkable now in 2026 to imagine Beneil Dariush being a significant threat to Islam Makhachev, that narrative was very well and alive prior to Benny's fight with Charles Oliveira, which is clearly demonstrated by the odds for that fight, which had Beneil Dariush as a favorite against Charles. But now, in 2026, Charles Oliveira, he's probably one fight away from another title shot. And Beneil Dariush, well, he's probably one fight away from not being ranked. And if he ends up losing his next fight, well, there's a very good chance that he ends up retiring. And this might just be me, but I think it really is a shame that Beneil Dariush ended up not fighting for the title, because, in my opinion, he definitely deserved to do so back when he was on that 8-fight win streak. But that sort of makes sense from the UFC's perspective, as Beneil Dariush was just never a big star in the star-studded lightweight division. So, at this point in Beneil Dariush's career, expect him to get fed to another killer at either lightweight or welterweight who will likely KO him yet again. And now, moving on to number 6 on this list, let's talk about Bekzat Almakhan. And now, Bekzat Almakhan, I believe, is the fighter who deserves the distinction of being the best fighter on the UFC roster who has a losing record in the promotion. And this is evident from the competition he has faced. Throughout his UFC tenure, Bekzat Almakhan has faced Umar Nurmagomedov, which was on short notice, Brad Katona, Alexandre Topuria, and John Matsumoto. And in that fight against Umar Nurmagomedov, he dropped Umar badly in the first round before getting taken down and controlled and beaten up on the ground. And then against Brad Katona, he knocked him out in the first round, which isn't the greatest win, but it's a win that proves that he belongs in the UFC. But then, the matchmaking he ended up getting after that win over Brad Katona just shows how brutal the UFC matchmaking was against him. He ended up getting matched up against Alexandre Topuria, Ilya's older brother, who has sort of a diet version of Ilya's style. And then, after taking that tough loss to Alexandre, where he ended up getting jabbed up and hurt, he ended up getting matched up with John Matsumoto, who is another tough prospect, and he ended up losing that fight as well. So, based off of Bekzat Almakhan's matchmaking outside of the rankings, you can tell that he's lost this much because he's been fighting exclusively incredibly difficult matchups, excluding, of course, Brad Katona, which was a fight that he won very easily. So yeah, the matchmakers really don't care if Bekzat Almakhan rises to the top or just sinks to the bottom and ends up getting cut, and that's why he is at number 6 on this list. And now, moving on to number 5 on this list, let's talk about a fighter who I believe hasn't gotten what he deserves despite the contributions he has made to the UFC entertainment-wise. And here I'm talking specifically about Terrence McKinney. And there is a very specific reason why I have Terrence McKinney this high up on the list. Now, as many of you already know, Terrence McKinney is probably one of the most exciting fighters in the UFC right now. Throughout the entirety of his professional career, Terrence McKinney has never gone to a decision. He has always either finished or been finished. He is the platonic ideal of a mid-card action fighter. He has been on both the giving and the receiving end of some highlight reel finishes throughout his UFC career. Notably, in his UFC debut against Matt Frevola, he set the record for the fastest KO in the history of the UFC lightweight division at 7 seconds into the first round, a record that still stands to this very day. And then in his fight against Drew Dober, he had a brutal one-round war, where he was beating Drew to a pulp before Drew Dober ended up TKOing him with a knee. And this fight, of course, was part of the reason why Drew Dober ended up getting known as the racially motivated lightweight gatekeeper. And now, while Terrence McKinney has gone on to alternate wins and losses from that point onwards, he's always been consistently entertaining. But here's the thing. Throughout his entire UFC career, Terrence McKinney has never once won a performance bonus, a fact that is completely baffling to me. He has a record of all finishes, win or lose, and he's had some fantastic one-round wars against the likes of Drew Dober and Chris Duncan. But for some reason, he has always missed out on the performance bonus. And at this point, I just have to feel bad for the guy. Maybe he's just been incredibly unlucky, but after 14 fights in the UFC, 8 of which are wins and no performance bonuses, I have to start wondering if Terrence McKinney, maybe he went behind Dana White's back and screwed his daughter or something like that. Because that's the only way that this sort of bad treatment from the UFC makes sense to me. I'll also add that he's recently had a falling out with Jaden Cable, who he was very tight with, because Jaden is somehow very tight with all of these UFC fighters. So yeah, his social media presence might take a bit of a hit there too as a result, leading to him further falling down the ranks of favorability among the UFC higher-ups. And that's why I have Terrence McKinney at number 5 on this list, because he has deserved a performance bonus for basically as long as he has been in the UFC, and he just hasn't gotten it. Now, moving on to number 4, let's talk about Michael Venom Page. And with MVP, I can very easily tell you why Michael Venom Page is not liked by the UFC. And there are 2 major reasons why. The first and very obvious one is that when MVP isn't fighting an opponent who is just going to march forward towards him in a straight line, his fights tend to get very boring. So far, every single fight in MVP's UFC career has gone to a decision. And all of those fights were pretty low output decisions as well, where MVP was bouncing outside of range, feinting, and then occasionally blitzing in to land a right hand or push over his opponent with his momentum. Like, seriously, look at the striking totals for these fights. 29-20 significant strikes over the course of 3 rounds against Jared Cannonier. 21-19 against Ian Gary. And then 27-12 against Sam Patterson. And that fight was probably one of the most boring fights in the history of the UFC. And MVP's fights being incredibly boring to watch is likely part of the reason why he has been getting the matchups he's been getting. After beating Shara Magomedov and Jared Cannonier, both of whom were ranked middleweights, he ended up getting Sam Patterson, an unranked welterweight. And then, after beating Sam Patterson, he is now getting Nursultan Ruzaboyev, an unranked middleweight/welterweight. And all of this is happening while MVP is 4-1 in the UFC, with that one loss being to Ian Gary, who is now fighting for the welterweight title. However, that is not the only reason why MVP is hated by the UFC, which leads me to the second reason, and that is that MVP, he is one of the few fighters who speaks up against the UFC for being match-made in the way he has been. And to demonstrate what I mean by this, here are a few clips from his recent interview with Ariel Helwani.
In addition to you, returning September 5th, Accor Arena, Nursultan Ruzabayev, when you were offered that name, and maybe it didn't go that way, so please let us know if I'm wrong in the way I'm phrasing this, what was your reaction?
In all honesty, it's quite frustrating. It has been frustrating. I feel like it's crazy that I've come to the pinnacle of MMA and trying to get names in the top 10 seems to be very, very difficult. Like, very, very difficult. The exchanges, I throw names forward and I'm like asking for starting from the top and I'm working my way down. And then Audie will present them. He'll get back, oh, this person's matched up, this person's injured, this person, just an excuse after excuse after excuse. Then I send, the list slate of names, and then again comes back, same thing happens. And then we got sent a couple of names. Nursultan was one of them as well. Say they might be available. We'd have to ask them. They might be available simply because they had only just fought not too long ago, but it was because it was early, like first round finishes. They potentially might want to take it. They should have decent enough time. So I'm just literally at the point where I'm just like, bro, just anybody that says yes, just let me get in there with them. Nursultan is obviously a tough opponent, but I was seeking bigger names, and I feel like I have been for the last 3 fights, and it's just nobody seems to want to step in there.
Is this the last fight on your UFC contract?
Yeah.
Do you think it will be your last UFC fight?
I don't want it to be. I just want to push for more bigger fights. I just want to push for bigger fights. My goal is still to get a belt, and I still feel more than capable, fast, strong, and I'm training. I feel great, so I know I can do it. So I would like to get an extension, but with the kind of get the UFC on side with like, okay, I want big names. I want like a rough idea of how I would get to that belt. Who do I have to fight? What do I have to do? Give me the exact blueprint and then let me go at it.
Michael Venom Page very clearly wants to fight for the UFC title. He very clearly wants to fight top-ranked contenders. But instead, he's getting Nursultan Ruziboyev despite being on a 3-fight win streak, 2 of which are against top-ranked contenders in the division above him. If anything proves that the UFC hates you, it's that. Especially since Nursultan Ruziboyev is kind of a nightmare matchup for MVP, being a 6'5" welterweight who can grapple. And since this is the final fight on MVP's contract, I think there's a very, very high likelihood that we may be seeing MVP in MVP MMA very soon, win or lose against Ruziboyev. And to be honest, that might be for the best, since MVP's reputation used to be much better back when he was crushing cans in Bellator, and being this entertainer/circus attraction for that promotion. But yes, that is why Michael Venom Page is a number 4 on this list. And now, moving on to number 3, let's talk about Farid Basharat. And with Farid here, the trend is very obvious. Farid Basharat is currently 16-0, undefeated, and is currently 7-0 in the UFC. He's ranked number 14 in the UFC's media rankings and ranked number 9 in the UFC's meta AI rankings. He's beaten tough competition outside of the rankings like John Matsumoto and Damon Blackshear. He's beaten formerly ranked opponents like Chris Gutierrez. And he even beat an opponent in Victor Hugo who blew weight by an entire weight class and getting the fight bumped up to 145 pounds. If we are just looking at the win streak Farid Basharat is on, he should be fighting for the title at this point. But that's not what's happening. Instead, at UFC 329, Farid Basharat was booked against Ethan Ewing, a highly touted prospect who had just beaten 2 undefeated guys in a row, and prior to that wasn't even in the UFC. And then, when Ethan Ewing pulled out due to an injury, ended up getting booked against John Garza, a 6-1 prospect right off of the regional scene. The matchmakers didn't even bother to find a guy in the UFC to fight Farid on short notice. And well, after getting a win over John Garza, Farid Basharat has come out and said that the UFC hasn't approached him with a new contract. So there is a decent likelihood that Farid Basharat may end up getting released from the UFC, Muhammad Mokaev style, despite not having lost not only in the UFC, but throughout his entire professional career. And well, as for why Farid Basharat has gotten this treatment from the UFC, I can think of 2 likely reasons. First, it's that Farid Basharat, well, he's just not the most entertaining fighter, having gone to a decision in all but one of his UFC fights, with his one submission victory being over Clayton Rodriguez, who was simply not a UFC-level opponent. And the second reason, and I'm frankly just speculating here, is that it's because Farid Basharat is from Afghanistan. Yes, he was raised in the United Kingdom, but he still is an Afghani citizen if I'm not mistaken. And perhaps that reality helps to explain why his brother, Javid Basharat, was released from the UFC despite coming off of a win. But anyways, regardless of the reason, it is incredibly clear that the UFC does not like Farid Basharat. And based off of his personality in interviews, where he comes across as quite level-headed, I don't even think it's some sort of personality issue like it was with Mokaev. The UFC just seems to think that he's too boring to be thrown up against the upper echelons of the bantamweight division, which explains why he was being booked against Ethan Ewing and ended up getting booked against John Garza, and now at this point might be headed to the PFL despite not having lost. And now, coming in at number 2 on this list, we have the man in the center of this video's thumbnail, Movsar Evloev. And with Movsar, it is incredibly clear that the UFC hates his guts. Movsar Evloev is 20-0, with 10 wins in the UFC. He has beaten ranked contenders like Dan Ige and Arnold Allen. He has beaten other previously undefeated fighters like Lerone Murphy, and he has beaten former champions like Aljamain Sterling. And he also beat Diego Lopez in Diego Lopez's short-notice UFC debut, and if you remember that fight, you would know that the reason why Diego Lopez had all the hype that he had was because he performed so well against Movsar on short notice. And Diego Lopez, well, he went on to fight for the title not once, but twice. And after beating Diego, Movsar went on to get 3 more wins. By all means, Movsar Evloev should have been booked for a title shot not just 1 fight ago, but 2 fights ago. But there are a couple reasons why Movsar Evloev is clearly despised by the UFC. First off, Movsar, well, all of those wins in the UFC, all of those 10 wins, they all come by decision. Movsar Evloev has never finished an opponent in the promotion. However, that doesn't mean that Movsar is boring. On the contrary, his fights with Arnold Allen, Aljamain Sterling, and Diego Lopez were all fun, and his fight with Diego Lopez won fight of the night. But that leads me to the second problem with Movsar, which is that he tends to pull out from fights a lot. Movsar Evloev has had 10 wins in the UFC, but he has also had 11 canceled fights. Now, granted, not all of those fights were canceled because of Movsar, but still, it shows that Movsar Evloev, he's not exactly the most reliable guy to be fighting for the title and have a main event revolving around. A fact that sort of makes it easier to see the UFC's perspective when it comes to not giving him a title shot. Movsar is also pretty inactive, having missed out on the entirety of 2025 and only fought a total of 5 times since 2022. However, all of that doesn't change the fact that he is very clearly the number 1 contender in the featherweight division, a status that he should have solidified with his win over Aljamain Sterling back in December of 2024. But if you guys remember what happened after that, you would know that in July of 2025, Movsar was booked against Aaron Pico, a fighter from Bellator who is making his UFC debut. Like, imagine being so despised by the UFC that the UFC brings over a guy from Bellator to fight you to try and take your number 1 contender spot. That's how desperate the UFC was to get rid of Movsar. And the irony of all of this is that by delaying Movsar Evloev's title shot, you make it more and more likely that he is going to win against Volkanovski because Volkanovski is just going to age out, right? Volkanovski is 37 years old, going on 38 this year, and he is already past his prime. So by delaying Movsar's title shot, they make it more and more likely that he's going to end up winning the belt. And before I end this section on Movsar Evloev here and move on to the honorable mentions for this list, one other reason why I believe that Movsar Evloev is kind of hated by the UFC is because despite him being a wrestler from the Caucasus, he is from Ingushetia and not from Dagestan, which means that he's not going to be training with the likes of Khabib and Islam, and therefore he's not going to get that sort of shine that the Dagestanis do, which in turn makes him just that much less marketable. But regardless of the lack of finishes and all of the pullouts, I feel really bad for Movsar Evloev because his career really has been stalled by the UFC, and there's a decent chance that it ends up backfiring on the UFC at this point. So now, moving on to the honorable or maybe dishonorable mentions for this video, let's go through 2 fighters who I believe that the UFC hates, but ended up sort of learning how to deal with. The first one, of course, is
the one, the only, remember the name, Muhammad!
And well, I believe that there's 2 reasons why Belal Muhammad was quite hated for a while. And the first one, of course, is that Belal, remember the name Muhammad, well, similar to Movsar, he was a massive decision merchant during his win streak. Now, of course, he did have that standing TKO against Sean Brady, but besides that, it's all decisions. However, he sort of ended up redeeming all of that by having that war against JDM, where he lost the title but ended up gaining a lot of respect, so, I think that he can be forgiven for that. But then, the second reason why is because, well, Belal Muhammad, he is Palestinian, and as we all know, the UFC is run by a bunch of
Brazilian
And that is why, after UFC 304, where Bilal Muhammad won the belt, and Dana White was asked about the lack of a Palestinian flag, this is what Dana White had to say.
Right before the main event, Bilal Muhammad's corner put the flag behind him on the fence, and what it looked like from press row was they were told to put it down. So I was just wondering, because there were other flags shown throughout the night, if that was kind of random or if that's a policy thing because of the war.
Palestine flag and somebody said take it down?
I don't know who it was, but it looked like it was someone from the UFC.
Right.
There's no like new flag policy thing because of anything.
I have no idea. But good try. You guys love to do that.
And then the second fighter who I believe is currently on very bad terms with the UFC is Tom Aspinall, who has signed with the talent agency of Dana White's arch nemesis, Eddie Hearn, and has been talking about stuff like going to boxing or going to MVP MMA and fighting Francis Ngannou. So yeah, there's no way that that relationship is still intact. But anyways, with that out of the way, let's now move on to number 1. And in number 1, I have Nathaniel Wood. And well, Nathaniel Wood's recent booking against Myron Santos was the inspiration behind me making this video. Nathaniel Wood is currently 11-3 in the UFC, on a 4-fight win streak, which should be an 8-fight win streak because he got brutally fouled by Muhammad Naimov in their fight, and now he's been booked against Myron Santos, an opponent who is 4-0 in the UFC, unranked, and missed weight in his last fight. And as Jack Slack pointed out on Twitter, Nathaniel Wood's career can be described as featherweight Sisyphus, because he's beaten Jose Delgado, Morgan Charrier, and even a debuting Lucine Queda, a guy who was a double champion in Octagon. And guess who he ends up getting? Myron Santos. Now, the good news for Nathaniel Wood is that he is ranked number 9 according to the UFC's AI meta rankings, but he is still unranked according to the UFC's media rankings, which is the rankings that the UFC is still currently using. But guess what? If Nathaniel Wood ends up losing to Myron Santos, well, he's going to end up losing that meta ranking as well. And frankly, I don't see why the UFC hates Nathaniel Wood this much. The guy is an entertaining fighter, he's a striker, and the only problem I guess with him is that he doesn't end up finishing his fights, but still, he ends up going to gritty wars. The Jose Delgado fight was fantastic. The Lucine Queda fight was a technical striking match. But the UFC just can't seem to give him a ranked opponent at any point in his UFC career, despite him being 11-3 and being a pretty fun striker to watch. The lack of reasons for the UFC to hate Nathaniel Wood and the treatment he ends up getting regardless is why I have him here at number 1. There's no reason I can think of conceivably as to why the UFC might dislike him, as is the case with somebody like Movzar. Who knows, maybe it's just an inside joke between Hunter Campbell and the matchmakers to screw over Nathaniel Wood's career in particular. But anyways, that's the entirety of this video. Thank you for watching or probably listening up until this point. And yes, thank you guys and goodbye.